On March 15, 1914, Eleanor Whitmore walked into the Blackwater County Sheriff's Office in Kentucky with tears streaming down her face. She reported that her 4 children had vanished without a trace from their locked bedroom during the night. The search party found no footprints in the mud, no signs of struggle, no broken windows or forced doors. But what they did find in Eleanor's cellar made them realize the children hadn't been taken at all. They had been made to disappear by someone who understood the difference between being gone and being erased. Someone who knew that motherhood could become something far more terrible than anyone imagined. Eleanor Whitmore arrived in Blackwater County in the autumn of 1913 with 4 children and no husband. She rented a small house on Elm Street with money she claimed came from her late husband's life insurance. The neighbors found her pleasant enough, though she kept to herself. Her children were well-behaved. Too well-behaved, some whispered. They never ran or shouted or played like normal children. The youngest was Tommy, age 4, with bright red hair and freckles. Then came the twins, Sarah and Samuel, both 7 years old with their mother's dark eyes. The oldest was Margaret, 10, who helped Eleanor with the household chores and watched her younger siblings with an intensity that made people uncomfortable. Eleanor worked as a seamstress from her home, taking in alterations and mending from the townspeople. She was skilled with needle and thread, they said, could fix anything that was torn or broken, make things look like they had never been damaged at all. Some customers swore she could make fabric stronger than it was before, like she was weaving something extra into the threads. The first sign that something was wrong came from their nearest neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, who lived in the house next door. She complained to her husband about strange sounds coming from the Whitmore property at night, not the usual sounds of a family settling down for sleep. Something else, something that sounded like voices, but too many voices for just 5 people. Mrs. Abernathy counted the voices one night when she couldn't sleep. She heard Eleanor's voice clearly, speaking in low tones. But then she heard what sounded like dozens of children responding, boys and girls of different ages, all talking at once in whispers that carried through the thin walls. When Mrs. Abernathy mentioned this to Eleanor at the market, Eleanor smiled and said her children sometimes played games where they pretended to have many friends. Imagination games, she called them. Mrs. Abernathy accepted this explanation, though she noticed Eleanor's children never seemed to actually play. They just stood perfectly still wherever their mother placed them, like dolls waiting for someone to move them. Winter in Blackwater County was harsh that year. Snow fell early and stayed late. The Whitmore children stopped coming outside altogether. Other families in town saw smoke rising from Eleanor's chimney, but no one spotted the children playing in their yard or walking to school. Eleanor claimed she was teaching them at home, which wasn't unusual for isolated families. But Mrs. Patterson, who taught at the local schoolhouse, became concerned when she realized she had never actually met Eleanor's children face to face. She had only seen them from a distance, standing at windows or walking behind their mother at the market, always in the background, always silent, always perfectly still. In February, Mrs. Patterson decided to pay Eleanor a social visit. She brought cookies for the children and knocked on the front door on a Thursday afternoon. Eleanor answered quickly as if she had been waiting by the door. She accepted the cookies gratefully but didn't invite Mrs. Patterson inside. "The children are napping," Eleanor explained. "They need their rest." Mrs. Patterson tried to peer past Eleanor into the house, but the interior was strangely dark despite being mid-afternoon. She thought she saw small figures moving in the shadows, but they moved wrong somehow, too smoothly, too quietly. "Perhaps I could meet them another time," Mrs. Patterson suggested. Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps. But another time never came. Mrs. Patterson tried visiting twice more, but Eleanor always had excuses. The children were ill. The children were busy with lessons. The children were helping with chores. Always the children, but never actually the children themselves. The truth began to emerge on March 14th, when Mrs. Abernathy heard screaming from the Whitmore house. Not the screaming of children in pain or fear. Something else. Something that sounded like joy, but felt wrong. Like celebration over something terrible. Mrs. Abernathy looked out her bedroom window and saw lights moving inside the Whitmore house. Not candlelight or lamplight. Something that pulsed and shifted like it was alive. The lights moved from room to room in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like a dance. Then the screaming stopped. The lights went out, and Mrs. Abernathy heard Eleanor's voice singing a lullaby in a language she didn't recognize. The next morning, Eleanor appeared at the sheriff's office in a state of apparent hysteria. She claimed her children had vanished during the night. She had put them to bed as usual, she said. But when she went to wake them for breakfast, their beds were empty. Their clothes were gone. Their toys were missing. It was as if they had never existed at all. Sheriff Collins organized a search party immediately. They combed through every inch of the Whitmore property and the surrounding woods. They checked the nearby creek for signs of drowning. They questioned every family in town about whether they had seen the children, but nobody had seen Eleanor's children in weeks. Some people couldn't even remember what they looked like. That's when Deputy Marshal Thompson made the discovery that changed everything. While searching the Whitmore cellar, he found Eleanor's sewing supplies arranged in a strange pattern on a wooden table. Needles, thread, scissors, and fabric were laid out with precise care. But mixed in with the normal sewing tools were other things. Things that didn't belong. Small bones arranged by size, locks of hair in different colors, teeth that had been carefully cleaned and polished. And in the center of it all, 4 small dolls made from what looked like human skin. The dolls were perfect miniatures of Eleanor's children. Every detail was exact, from Tommy's red hair to Margaret's serious expression. But the most disturbing part was how realistic they looked. The skin had texture and warmth. The hair seemed to grow from actual scalps. The eyes followed people as they moved around the room. When Sheriff Collins confronted Eleanor about the dolls, she didn't deny making them. Instead, she picked up the smallest doll, the one that looked like Tommy, and cradled it against her chest. "This is my son," she said simply. "All of these are my children." Sheriff Collins asked what happened to her real children. Eleanor looked at him like he was asking a foolish question. "These are my real children. I made them better. I made them perfect. They don't cry anymore. They don't get sick. They don't grow old or leave me or die. They're exactly what children should be." If this story is making your skin crawl, make sure to subscribe now because Eleanor's methods get much more disturbing from here. The investigation revealed that Eleanor had been planning this transformation for months. Her neighbors began remembering strange deliveries to her house during the winter. Packages that arrived at odd hours, carried by men who didn't look like normal delivery workers. Men who moved too quietly and never spoke to anyone else in town. Inside Eleanor's bedroom, investigators found journals dating back to her arrival in Blackwater County. The early entries seemed normal enough. A widow trying to care for her children alone, worries about money and winter and keeping her family safe. But as the pages progressed, Eleanor's writing changed. She began describing her children as burdens. They needed too much food, too much attention, too much care. They got sick and required medicine. They asked questions she couldn't answer. They had needs she couldn't meet. But worst of all, they were growing up, growing away from her, becoming independent. Eleanor wrote about meeting someone who understood her problems, someone who offered her a solution. The entries called this person the seamstress, but never gave a real name. The seamstress taught Eleanor special techniques, ways to preserve what was precious, ways to make temporary things permanent. The final entry in Eleanor's journal was dated March 13th, the night before she reported her children missing. "Tonight, I finished the work. The seamstress showed me how to capture everything important about them and put it somewhere safe. Their voices, their faces, their love for me. All of it will be preserved forever in forms that can never leave me. They will be my perfect children for eternity." When investigators pressed Eleanor for details about what happened to her children's bodies, she became agitated. She insisted the dolls were her children now. The bodies had just been unnecessary parts that got in the way of true motherhood. She had disposed of the unnecessary parts, she said, the same way a dressmaker throws away fabric scraps after completing a garment. But Eleanor refused to say where those scraps had gone. The search expanded beyond Blackwater County. Police contacted other towns throughout Kentucky, asking about missing children or strange reports involving mothers and dolls. What they discovered made them realize Eleanor's case was part of something much larger. Over the previous 2 years, at least a dozen children had vanished from small towns across the state. In each case, the child had disappeared without a trace from locked rooms. In each case, the parents seemed strangely calm about the disappearance. And in several cases, neighbors reported seeing the parents carrying around dolls that looked exactly like their missing children. The pattern suggested that Eleanor wasn't working alone. Someone was teaching desperate parents how to transform their children into more manageable forms. Someone who called herself the seamstress and understood techniques that went far beyond normal needlework. Deputy Marshal Thompson followed the trail to an abandoned textile mill outside Louisville. Inside the mill, he found workshops filled with sewing equipment, but also other tools, medical instruments, preservation chemicals, and dozens of dolls that looked like real children. The dolls were arranged in family groups around small tables, as if frozen in the middle of meals or conversations. Some were dressed in fine clothes and positioned in elaborate scenes. Others sat alone in corners, their glass eyes staring at nothing. All of them had the same uncanny realism as Eleanor's creations. In the center of the mill, Thompson found the seamstress herself. She appeared to be a woman in her 60s, dressed in black fabric that seemed to absorb light. Her hands were stained permanently dark from whatever chemicals she used in her work. When she spoke, her voice sounded like it came from very far away. "I help mothers love their children properly," she explained when Thompson arrested her. "Real children are so difficult. They grow and change and eventually leave. My children stay exactly as they should be, perfect and beautiful and obedient. Forever." The seamstress claimed to have been perfecting her techniques for over 30 years. She traveled from town to town, finding mothers who struggled with the demands of motherhood. Mothers who were overwhelmed or desperate or simply tired of children who wouldn't behave. She offered them a solution that seemed like answered prayers, but the process required more than just skill with needle and thread. It required materials that could only be obtained from the children themselves. Living materials. Essential materials. The kind of materials that left nothing behind when the work was finished. Thompson asked what happened to the children's souls. The seamstress smiled and gestured toward her collection of dolls. "They're right here, captured and preserved in forms that will never age or decay. These mothers can love their children forever now, without any of the complications that come with living children." The investigation revealed that Eleanor had been planning her children's transformation since shortly after arriving in Blackwater County. She had contacted the seamstress through letters, describing her problems with motherhood. The seamstress had responded with detailed instructions and promises that Eleanor's maternal troubles would soon be over. But Eleanor's case was different from the others. Most of the mothers who worked with the seamstress had only transformed 1 or 2 children. Eleanor was attempting to transform all 4 of hers at once. The process required more materials than usual, more preparation, more ritual. The ritual had taken place on March 13th in Eleanor's cellar, using tools and techniques the seamstress had taught her through months of correspondence. Eleanor had convinced her children it was a game, a special game where they had to lie very still while Mommy worked her magic. The children had trusted her completely. By morning, Eleanor had 4 perfect dolls and no living children. She was finally the mother she had always wanted to be, patient and loving and never overwhelmed by demands she couldn't meet. Her children would never disobey her again, never grow up and leave her, never cause her another moment of worry or stress. When authorities searched Eleanor's property one final time, they found evidence of the ritual in her cellar. Blood stains that had been carefully cleaned but not completely removed. Strange symbols drawn on the walls in what appeared to be organic materials, and a collection of small items that had belonged to her children, arranged with ceremonial precision. But they never found the children's bodies. Eleanor claimed the transformation had been complete. Nothing was left behind because everything important had been captured in the dolls. The rest was just waste material that had been properly disposed of through methods the seamstress had taught her. The trial of Eleanor Whitmore began in June 1914 and attracted attention from newspapers across the country. People were fascinated and horrified by the idea of a mother who had literally sewn her children into permanent submission. Eleanor showed no remorse during the proceedings. She maintained that she had been a loving mother who found a way to love her children forever. The dolls were presented as evidence during the trial. Several witnesses reported that the dolls seemed to move when no one was looking directly at them. Others claimed they could hear the dolls whispering among themselves during quiet moments in the courtroom. The judge ordered the dolls to be removed after a juror fainted while examining them. Eleanor was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But on the night before her transfer to the state penitentiary, she managed to escape from the Blackwater County Jail. The cell door was found standing open the next morning, but it was still locked from the outside. No keys were missing, no windows were broken. Eleanor had simply vanished, just like her children. Some people believed the seamstress had helped Eleanor escape. Others thought Eleanor had used the same techniques on herself that she had used on her children, that she had transformed herself into something that could move through locked doors and disappear into shadows. The abandoned mill outside Louisville was thoroughly searched after Eleanor's escape. The authorities found more evidence of the seamstress's work, including detailed journals describing her transformation techniques. But the seamstress herself was gone. She had vanished along with most of her doll collection, leaving behind only empty workshops and the lingering smell of preserving chemicals. Over the following months, reports of missing children decreased significantly throughout Kentucky. But families began reporting a different kind of problem. Parents claimed their children were becoming too obedient, too quiet, too perfect. Children who had been energetic and talkative suddenly became still and silent. They followed instructions without question. They never complained or argued or asked for things. At first, parents were grateful for the change. But as weeks passed, some began to worry that their children were becoming too much like dolls. Beautiful and well-behaved, but somehow not quite alive in the way children should be. Mrs. Henderson from Maysville wrote to the authorities about her 8-year-old daughter, Lucy. "She sits exactly where I place her and doesn't move until I tell her to. She eats what I give her without complaint. She goes to bed when I say and wakes when I call. She's everything I always wanted in a child. So why does she terrify me?" The letter continued. "Yesterday I watched her for an hour without her knowing. She didn't blink. She didn't shift position. She didn't even seem to breathe. When I called her name, she turned toward me with a smile that looked painted on. I'm beginning to think my real daughter is gone, and something else is wearing her face." Similar reports came from dozens of families across Kentucky. Children who had become too perfect, too compliant, too much like the dolls Eleanor had created from her own offspring. The transformation process, it seemed, could work at a distance. The seamstress had found ways to modify children without physically taking them from their homes. In 1916, 2 years after Eleanor's trial, a traveling preacher named Reverend Marcus arrived in Blackwater County. He claimed to specialize in cases involving supernatural influences on families. Several parents brought their 2 perfect children to him for examination. Reverend Marcus spent hours studying the affected children. He observed their movements, listened to their speech patterns, and tested their responses to various stimuli. His conclusion was disturbing. "These are not your children anymore. Your children's souls have been removed and stored elsewhere. What you have now are shells that have been programmed to behave as you always wished your children would behave." When parents asked where their children's souls had been stored, Reverend Marcus pointed toward Eleanor's abandoned house on Elm Street. "She's still there," he said. "She never really left, and she's been collecting children's souls to add to her family. Every child she transforms becomes another member of her perfect household." The house had been empty since Eleanor's escape, but neighbors had noticed strange things. Lights in windows at night when no one should be home. The sound of children playing in the yard, though no children were ever seen. Most disturbing of all, the house seemed to be growing. New rooms appeared overnight. extra windows, additional doors that led to spaces that shouldn't exist. Reverend Marcus organized an expedition to investigate the house. When they forced open the front door, they found rooms filled with dolls, hundreds of them, arranged in perfect family groups around dining tables, sitting in chairs, lying in beds. All of them looked like real children. All of them seemed aware of the intruders. In the largest room, they found Eleanor. She sat in a rocking chair, surrounded by the 4 dolls she had made from her own children. But Eleanor looked different now. Her skin had the same waxy texture as her dolls. Her movements were too smooth, too precise. When she spoke, her voice had the flat quality of something that was remembering how to talk rather than actually thinking of words. "My family keeps growing," Eleanor told the expedition. "Every mother who struggles with difficult children can bring them to me. I help them become the children they were always meant to be. Perfect children, obedient children, children who will never disappoint their parents again." She gestured around the room at her collection. "These are all someone's children, and they're all exactly what their parents wanted them to become. Beautiful and quiet, and well-behaved forever." Reverend Marcus asked Eleanor what she had done to herself. Eleanor smiled with lips that didn't move naturally. "I became what I needed to be, the perfect mother. I don't get tired anymore. I don't lose patience. I don't make mistakes. I can care for as many children as parents bring to me, and I will love them all equally forever." The expedition tried to destroy the dolls, thinking this might free the trapped children's souls. But when they touched the dolls screamed. Not with their mouths, but with voices that came from everywhere at once. The sound was so terrible that several men collapsed. Others ran from the house and refused to return. Eleanor watched these attempts calmly. "You can't separate a mother from her children," she explained. "We're connected now in ways that can't be broken. They are part of me, and I am part of them. This is what love looks like when it's perfected." The authorities decided to burn the house down, hoping to end whatever was happening inside. They evacuated the surrounding neighborhood and set fire to the building on a calm evening in September 1916. The fire burned for 3 days straight, consuming not just the house, but somehow burning deeper into the ground itself. When the flames finally died, nothing was left but a perfect circle of ash. No foundation, no cellar, no evidence that a house had ever stood there. The ground was completely smooth, as if someone had erased the entire property from existence. But the children who had been transformed didn't return to normal. They remained perfect and obedient and slightly wrong. Their parents learned to live with children who were everything they had thought they wanted, but somehow not quite human anymore. And sometimes, on quiet nights, those parents heard other voices joining their 2 perfect children's bedtime prayers. Dozens of children's voices, all speaking in unison, all thanking someone they called Mother Eleanor for making them exactly what they needed to be. Because the perfect mother never really stops collecting children. She just finds new ways to expand her family, new methods to help other mothers achieve the same perfection she discovered in that cellar in Blackwater County. The circle of ash where Eleanor's house once stood never grew grass or weeds. It remained perfectly smooth and empty, as if the ground itself was waiting for something. Local children avoided the area, though they couldn't explain why. They just knew that walking across that circle felt wrong, like stepping on something that was pretending to be solid ground. In 1920, the town council decided to build a small park over the empty lot. They brought in new soil and planted flowers and installed a bench where people could sit and enjoy the afternoon sun. But the flowers never bloomed properly. They grew in strange patterns, arranging themselves in shapes that looked almost like children holding hands. And the bench was never empty for long. People who sat there reported feeling like someone was watching them, someone who was very interested in how they treated their own children, someone who was always ready to offer help to parents who found motherhood more difficult than they had expected. The techniques Eleanor learned from the seamstress spread beyond Kentucky in the years following her disappearance. Reports of 2 perfect children began appearing in newspapers across the American South. Children who had become exactly what their parents claimed to want. but who no longer seemed quite alive in the way children should be. Child psychologists of the era documented hundreds of cases involving what they termed artificial behavioral modification in juvenile subjects. These children displayed perfect obedience, flawless manners, and complete emotional control. They never threw tantrums or argued with adults or showed any signs of normal childhood rebellion. On paper, they sounded like ideal children, but their parents invariably described feeling unsettled by their offspring's perfection. Something important was missing, they said, something that made children feel like real people rather than very sophisticated toys. The last confirmed sighting of Eleanor Whitmore occurred in 1932, during the height of the Great Depression. A traveling photographer named William Hayes claimed he encountered her at a farmhouse outside Lexington, Kentucky. She was offering to help struggling families with their most difficult children, he reported, making them easier to manage during hard times. Hayes photographed Eleanor from a distance before she noticed him. In the photograph, she appears surrounded by dozens of children, all standing in perfect rows like soldiers awaiting orders. But Hayes swore that when he looked through his camera lens, he could see other children standing in the same spots. Children who looked frightened and were silently screaming for help. When Hayes tried to approach Eleanor to ask questions, she and all the children simply faded away like morning mist. He was left standing alone in an empty field, holding a photograph of people who were no longer entirely people. The photograph was displayed in Hayes' studio for years, but visitors found it disturbing to look at for more than a few seconds. The children's eyes seemed to follow people around the room, and several customers claimed they could hear whispering coming from the image itself. In 1955, Hayes died in his sleep, and his nephew inherited the photography studio. While cleaning out the old man's belongings, the nephew found the photograph of Eleanor and her perfect children, but the image had changed. Now it showed Eleanor standing alone, smiling at the camera with arms outstretched as if welcoming new additions to her family. The nephew threw the photograph away, but it reappeared in the studio the next morning, displayed in the exact same frame, in the exact same location. This happened several more times before the nephew finally abandoned the building entirely, leaving everything behind rather than deal with whatever was happening there. The studio stood empty for decades, but people passing by at night sometimes saw lights in the windows and heard the sound of children laughing. Always too many children for the size of the building. Always perfectly synchronized laughter that sounded more like an echo of joy than actual happiness. Today, the building houses a small museum dedicated to local history. Tour guides tell visitors about Eleanor Whitmore and her strange case, treating it as an interesting piece of regional folklore. But they don't mention that some of the museum's displays seem to rearrange themselves overnight, or that visitors sometimes report seeing additional children in the historical photographs, children who weren't there when the pictures were originally taken. Eleanor's story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of wanting perfect children, but it's also something more than that. It's a reminder that some mothers never stop being mothers, even when motherhood transforms into something unrecognizable, even when love becomes something that preserves rather than nurtures. Because the perfect mother is still out there somewhere, still collecting children who need to be improved, still helping parents who find real children too difficult to manage. And she's always ready to welcome new additions to her family of beautiful, obedient, perfectly preserved